We acknowledge the original owners of the land on which we podcast, whose stories were told for thousands of years. Today, we are recording in Meanjin. We pay our respects to elders past and present who may be listening. Sovereignty was never ceded. A quick note before we get started that there may be some swearing in today's podcast. If you don't like swearing or usually listen with children in the car, you have been warned. This episode of What in the NDIS Now is brought to you by Astalty. Astalty is the software solution for NDIS professionals built by NDIS professionals. Astalty is my go-to software, and Astalty is trusted and loved by hundreds of other NDIS providers. I love how easy it is to use and how it keeps all my participant information, notes, and invoicing all in one place, available to me anytime from any device. Sign up now for your 14-day free trial. Head to astalty.com.au to sign up now. See for yourself how much easier managing all your NDIS business needs are by using Astalty. Thanks again to Astalty for sponsoring today's episode. You're listening to What in the NDIS, the News, a podcast where I, Hannah Redford, and my friend Sam Rosenbaum discuss all the hot topics out of the NDIS. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's show. This was a big topic, and I realized when I listened back, I forgot one really critical bit of information. And so I wanted to do an intro and tell you about the bit that I forgot. That is that the changes that are coming in from the 19th of May are for new plans that are released after the 19th of May. So it doesn't apply to everyone's plans all of a sudden. It's just as they get renewed and you get a new plan from here on out, this will start to be a thing. So I just wanted to make sure that that was really clear, that it's just for new plans and not for everybody for a little while. It's going to take a while to fully implement. Other than that, I hope you have an awesome day and enjoy listening to this news episode. Hi, Sam. How are you going?
Yeah, really well, Hannah. How about yourself?
I'm okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose I might be lying when I say I'm really good. If I'm living in my personal life, really good. But let's face it, in the reality of what we deal with in our day-to-day in the NDIS world, it is a bit of an interesting time.
It is. So I do want to start by saying how I do truly love the NDIS, because I do think it is revolutionary in its intent, and I think a lot of people have had help that have never had help before the NDIS, and that people wouldn't be as supported as they are without it. And so I just really wanted to stress that, because today, when we talk about some of the issues, and so often people are getting bogged down in how horrible things are going in the NDIS, and we forget that actually it's really cool, and it is really awesome that we have it, and it is really awesome what it can do, and it is changing lives. So I just wanted to say that up front. So Sam, the NDIS have a new minister. Can you tell me a little bit about the new NDIS minister?
Yeah, so there's been quite a big change within the structure of how the NDIS is going to be overseen. So it's not just a minister now, we've got ministers. And there's also been a whole change to the portfolios and where the NDIS and their responsibilities lie in terms of department. So, and the really interesting thing is we've also got ministers that are in cabinet and not in cabinet. So let's break it down. We've got the Honourable Mark Butler. So he's going to be a cabinet minister, and he's the cabinet minister for health, ageing, and disability. So this is part of the big changes within the responsibility. The NDIS is moving away from Department of Social Services, and we're moving to the Department of Health, Disability, and Ageing, which now oversees the NDIS service and policies. It's going to include the foundational supports. Hoping that he can get some movement within the states and carer policies. But on that foundational supports, it's probably a very interesting spot, especially from a negotiating point with the states and the hold-ups and everything that we've sort of seen in terms of traction and the confusing space we've got there. So alongside Mark Butler, we've got Senator Jenny McAllister, and so she's going to be the sole minister for NDIS. But she's not in cabinet, and her role is going to include handling the day-to-day operations of the NDIS and implementations of the reform. Her background comes from Minister for Emergency Management, and she's from New South Wales. Then we have Tanya Plibersek is taking over as the Minister for Social Services. She is going to be handling and overseeing social policy, including community support services, disability, employment, and income support, so the DSP. So she's been around for quite a while. She was the former Minister for the Environment. She's been in Parliament for a very long time.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that. What I'm wondering is, and we won't know this straight off the bat, but I'm wondering the implications of moving the NDIS into the Department of Health, Disability and Ageing. Because I'm concerned that is a move backwards back to having disability as a health issue and not as a social service, which is what we were sort of attempting to do when the NDIS rolled out.
I think there definitely is some valid concerns. The model of care and the overall service delivery is definitely different, and a lot of the service practices instilled from that comes rooted in. But it's probably important to note that it's not just health, it's health, aged, disability, and the NDIS. So it's a very broad portfolio. Mark Butler has been the former Minister for Mental Health, Housing and Homeless, Social Inclusion and Climate Change. So he comes from a really strong background with founding in social causes and grassroots issues from that perspective. So he's not solely a health minister, and he hasn't had a big health portfolio, but he's been very much aligned. And he does come from, he's been in Parliament coming on almost 2 decades now. So he's been in since 2007. So I think it's potentially good mark. There's a lot of potential there. I don't think we should be jumping too heavily. Well, look, I've preached the optimistic pathway and been terribly disappointed before in the pathway. So it's still a watch this space, and look, we might actually see a response to the NDIS review. Who knows? But we'll see. But there are valid concerns, but it's a bigger portfolio than just health.
I also think it's interesting that they've got 2 ministers now for it, sort of almost saying it is massive and we actually need, it takes more than one person to wrangle this circus.
Yeah, so that's why it's really important. and I think with having the two roles, because it is very complex. So Mike Butler was taking it more from a strategic level and reforming and managing the integrations with Health and Aging Service, where Senator McAllister is handling the day-to-day operations and the implementations of the reforms, which is why I'm thinking we might see a response, hopefully sooner rather than later. Although with everything that what's happened between then and now, we can already see what that response is going to be, I think. So it's a really big watch this space. But the really cool thing about all of this, and there's been lots of talk happening for quite a long time around the pricing of NDIS supports. So all of this realignment is hopefully in everyone's thoughts and prayers is going to be making a way for an independent health and aged care pricing authority to take over the NDIS pricing and aged care pricing. This also aligns with a lot of the stuff that seems to be happening in Fair Work around minimum wages and alignment between the complexity of SHADs, which I know every provider is going to be super excited with. And I have heard some rumors as well that it's going to be compressed into one lovely schedule and not cause endless nightmares for bookkeepers and business owners and payroll managers alike.
Oh my God, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I don't know. But look, I'm getting optimistic again. So I did start with that with thoughts and prayers, I guess. So who knows?
We pray to all the gods and the universe. We're not picky about the gods.
Fingers crossed. Who knows? But yeah, it's definitely a watch this space. And especially now, which probably is the right way to sort of move into the changes that are coming in from the changes with the NDIS Act specific to Section 33.
Yes. So let me tell you a little bit about it. Now, I want to preface this by it starts today, Sam. Today, Monday the 19th of May. And here's part of the problem. There was no announcement. There is no news article. There is no media release from the NDIS about this change. They're just doing it under the radar, and it's huge.
Shock and horror, poor communications. Though it was part of the act that it was coming in from this point in this, but this comes down to that poor governance and poor communications. We haven't had that response from the government as to the NDIS review. We've just had broad sweeping changes in the NDIS Act, a whole heap of operational changes, a whole heap of stuff from the Commission, and a whole heap of things going, oh, this is what we're going to be doing. And all with this, let's do it collaboratively and community consultation and groups. Yay! That was very characteristic of a cartoon that I don't think we can say for copyright reasons. But yeah.
Let me start there, because they are now activating a part of the legislation that was brought in on the 3rd of October 2024. And that section that they are activating is called Section 33. Before I go further, what I want to explain to our listeners is that they are changing a lot of words, and we've got new words for things. And what I want you all to know and do is that no more old words on your websites, because we all need to start using the new words, because that's what planners and people at the NDIA will be using. And if you use old words, when participants talk to the NDIA, they will get confused. So I want everyone to make a concerted effort right here, right now, that you are going to use new words, leave the old words back in the dust. And I want you all to go to your websites right now, pause the podcast, go right now and update your websites. I don't want to see any websites that use the word price guide. It hasn't been called a price guide for years. It is the pricing arrangements and price limits document. No more price guide. Okay?
Yeah, that's right, Hannah. There's heaps of new words and new frameworks and that sort of thing that's coming up. And that change from the paper, my gosh. If people have still got that using pricing guide, there's something not right there. Anyway, but what are some of these key words that are changing? And what are the words that we used to use? What are some of the words we're using? And then maybe let's break down what those changes are going to be.
Okay, I'm going to do my best, but this is, it is pretty complex and it's going to be a little bit evolving. So one of the things I will say is that the NDIS is holding information sessions over the next few weeks, specifically on Section 33. Sam, why are they doing it after they're implementing Section 33?
Well, I'll revert to my last preamble, but you did manage to lock into one of them on last Thursday, and that was quite a bit of experience for you. And I think that it all sums up in your experience that you're going with on the Q&A. It was from what you're saying. It's stonewalling. It's nothing. It's the NDIS being reactive because they're all running secret squirrel internally without having a formal response. And the agencies and the commission are just going with the minimalist sort of thing because there's nothing formal announced by the government other than the legislative instruments that they've put forward. So the agency is at a kind of a block to how to be able to do this, and they're running information sessions, not consultation sessions, because they don't know. Or they know, but they can't, until there's that public release from the government, they can't, they're public service officers. So it's confusing, as you said, complex, and just not within the lines of what they've been all trying to say. I think it's all very fucked. But I digress.
Okay, yeah. I totally did too, so I'm so sorry. We're going to go back to the new words. There are 3 main new words that you need to understand. Number 1 is funding amounts, then funding components, and third is funding periods. Okay?
All right, so 3 nice little new words.
Yes. So let me go to funding amounts. This is the total value in an NDIS plan. This is the bit that was usually at the top of the plan that said how much was in all the categories all together. This is how much it is. This now is going to be called a funding amount. Then we've got funding components. Funding components are the new word for categories. The categories were things like core and capacity building and capital. Now they are called funding components. Then we've got funding periods. Now this is a relatively new part, although it was flagged when PACE initially came in, and then they couldn't get PACE to do it, so they walked it back. So the idea of funding periods is that, for example, if you have a 2-year plan or a 3-year plan, what will happen is you will have 3 months at a time of funding available. So for your funding component core, for example, you will have 3 months worth of funding released at each time.
So you're right. The concept around funding periods was brought up during PACE, and the way that it's really complex. Look, but this is all very kind of really complex, and you're right when we said at the start, it's really poor communication from the agency, because as you and I both know, in trying to work out how to get this information out for the 19th, it has caused us a nightmare of headaches trying to unravel this. The breakdown of a funding period, though, is think of either months, quarterly, or half-year periods. And the idea that that this is going to do is, rather than giving access to $100,000 for a year plan or a 2-year plan, it'll be broken down into either, if it's a 2-year plan, it might, for example, be $50,000 for year 1 and $50,000 for year 2. Or they could break it down into 6 months lots, which would be $25,000 for each 6-month period.
So in the information session I went to on Thursday, they said that funding periods will be defaulted to 3 months unless you are in SIL, which it will then be 1 month. Or if you're doing a housing modification, then that will be available, because housing modifications are very different. So you will have 3 months available of funding at any time.
So this is going to have some really big impacts on participants and providers in really different ways. And the other thing I think everyone really needs to note is how we work together and how we build support from a provider perspective, and how we engage and utilize our support and our plans needs to be a lot more collaborative approach. And there's going to be a lot of issues, especially for teething issues, due to the lack of communication. It was said heaps so far. But the biggest kind of thing is, how do we kind of set up the parameters for engaging and working with participants and providers to make sure that we're not going over that funding period, or that what's happening if we don't utilize all the money. Because I know there's lots of families out there that leverage fluctuating money in their plans. So they might not use a lot during the school periods, but they might use a lot more through the school holidays. And I think these kind of ideas is going to have some really big impacts on families and how they utilize the money that they have, and probably work with the different providers as well.
Yeah, and even people with, say, have a degenerative condition, they might suddenly get worse, and then more funding needs to be implemented straight away. So it's a little bit concerning.
Unfortunately, I do think, might not be for that scenario, but that reason is why the agency is implementing this. And it actually goes back to the Wild West of the last 10 years. And more importantly, the earlier days where there was just no information, everyone was rolling out every kind of support, and quite frankly, ramping up over COVID a lot of support coordinator strategies, because every networking event, that's how it was done, was let's ramp up services because there's a need for it. You've got a lot less isolation, but there's no kind of money oversight. That decision has been independently made by a support coordinator, that ultimately end goal was to force everything to go to the agency to ask for more money. And yes, I'm getting very big glares from Hannah, and I'm sure there's a lot of hate from support coordinators now. But for the support coordinators that are really ethical and really want to work for the best for their participants, can you really deep down say that wasn't a strategy from a lot of people that may not have had the best intentions? Tell me I'm wrong.
But you are solely laying the blame onto support coordinators, which is not correct. Even if some support coordinators were responsible for a component of this, they are not the be-all and end-all of funding fucking up.
No, you are right. And for labeling solely on support coordinators there, definitely probably not the right approach. But the reality is, I did hear in so many networking events and so many different things. Because remembering that I'm not just a consultant, I've also done a lot as a provider, both direct services and in support coordination. This is an active thing that everyone was kind of happy that they could do it as a strategy to get more money. Like, I get your point and I get where you're coming from, and I get this scenario around some really hard, complex cases with especially where that NDIS was underfunding to start off with. 100% agree. There was definitely some real issues where people weren't underfunded, and this was just a course of the shitstorm that was for that thing because the agency didn't plan enough in the first fucking place. There's a lot of reasons where your point is very valid, but there was just this mentality of use services and I can go for a review from everyone, including participants, support coordinators, and I might have hit hard on support coordinators, but I heard a lot of support coordinators actively doing it. And this was my gripe with the industry, because all of us within it that had that, because I won't say that I didn't use that as a strategy at one point in time either, or there was shitstorm happening that it just needed, because the whole idea of dealing with complex and intersectionality ideas, especially when you're dealing with underfunded plans, shit hits the fucking wall, as we all know. But ultimately, there was a bit while there was some good intent and need for this, the greater cohort of the situation was taking it for advantage, and this is why the government has cracked down on it all. And I might be getting a lot of hate from the room, but since when have I really cared if people like me or not? I'm honest. It's why I do what I do, because I love this sector. But if we're going to talk about like the shitstorm that's coming on funding periods, everyone needs to stop and take a look in the mirror at the same time, where like the government might be shoving this onto us. It might be a whole heap of change, but anyone in the room or listening that says they have not done that in a plan without thinking of the funding ramifications from a government body that controls the funding money, this is the problem. Sorry, end rant.
Okay, so let me just quickly go back over the words that we're using that are coming in now so that we're sure we've got them. Okay, so we've got a funding amount, we've got funding components, and we've got funding periods. Okay, great. So Sam, can you tell me some of the impacts you can see from these changes?
Yeah, so I'll leave all the stuff that I put in from the rant completely alone, because we've already touched a lot on some of those sort of things, because it's both a negative, positive, who knows on that, it's indeterminate. All of this is going to be around how the communication from it, but it's increased complexity is the starting point of a negative for both providers and participants because of the lack of communication. The fact that it's took a lot longer than any other news episode for two points to get this episode together is a testament to the complexity of the changes in Section 33. The administrative burden as well, touching back on that point earlier around the implementation and working together to understand it. Providers and participants, we're going to have to understand from a provider point, what is the funding period? How much is in that funding period? How do we manage each of those funding periods? Also, if there's also rollover from those funding periods is something that needs to be questioned, because if we've got money left over at the end of the plan, are we still rolling over, and can that kind of strategy work? Who knows? That's a big, I'm not too sure if you got too much clarity on that the other day.
Yeah. So if there's leftover funding in the funding period, it can be rolled over to the next funding period, absolutely. But if you get to the end of the plan and there's still money there, that can't be rolled over to the next plan. So between funding periods, yes, but not at the end of the plan. So I can tell you that this will be very difficult for support coordinators, because support coordinators often use more funding at the beginning of a plan to implement it and more funding at the end of the plan. So this is funding periods are going to make support coordination far, far more difficult. It's also going to make behaviour support more difficult because, again, behaviour support often has a lot of work to do up front. And now that we can only use a tiny fraction of the whole funding at any given time is going to complicate that. The next bit where it's going to get complicated is with invoicing, because if you support Mary on Monday and on Thursday, but the funding period ends on Wednesday, you cannot have an invoice that goes over 2 funding periods, even if there's going to be a little bit of money roll over into the next funding period, and it's fine, there's plenty of money. That doesn't matter because your invoice can only be within the funding period. Okay, so then you support Mary Monday and Thursday, but the funding period ends on Wednesday. Now you have to make 2 invoices, one for Monday, one for Thursday.
All right, so from single invoices, I can hear that there's going to be some really big changes that providers need to pay attention to, especially when they're doing exports from their CRM systems around invoice timelines, because the way that systems work is they'll do an invoice based on a batch, and that will be the invoice and upload that. So providers are going to have a real good look at what those periods are, how they export it, and probably have a good chat with their service provider around what work they've done for your system to be able to cope and manage with this moving forward, especially because as of today, we're hitting the grounds running and we're going to need to be on top of it pretty quickly.
Yeah. So, Sam, my biggest concern with this is that participant privacy is now out the window completely. So we talked about this a little bit with the impairments, when we talked about impairments coming in, that what you do as a provider has to be able to be justified back to the person's impairment. So they will now have to show you their impairment notice. Beyond that, they now will have to show you their entire plan, because you have to see those funding periods unless they are a very capable and smart participant, which many are, don't get me wrong. If that participant is able to very clearly state the first funding period is from this date to this date, the second funding period is this date to this date, and this is how much is there and whatever. If they can't very clearly say that to you, then you will have to have a look at that plan. And the NDIA have always maintained that participants do not need to show their plans to providers. And a lot of participants have taken that to heart and say absolutely never ever, and actually it's a red flag if a provider asks me for a plan. But now with funding periods and the fact that invoicing is made astronomically more difficult, what are we meant to do as providers? Because you do absolutely need to be able to see when that funding period is. How do you do that without asking for the plan?
Well, this is the thing that I've had from day one, especially back in my early days in support coordination. If we don't have the plan as support coordinators, we can't really do anything at the end of the day. It comes down to be our eligibility as providers and access, service and access criteria. Essentially, every provider should have some description of these are the people. This is the people that I will say yes, I'm serving to. This is the criteria people have to meet. Which obviously one needs to be: is it going to be NDIS funded, or how is it funded? Going from there, if you're a mental health support worker but with no experience dealing with dysphagia or high need supports, you should be having clearly in your access point that you support participants that have mental health things, but you won't, unfortunately, can't meet the criteria to support someone with high need support. That should be clearly identified within your scope of practice who you can and can't provide as an individual or as a provider. Part of that also needs to be around the information that you get given. Do I think that we have to hand over plans? No, I don't think we're going to get to that point, but there definitely has to be some sort of more information sharing from a participant's perspective to ensure that they get the support that they actually need in a competent manner. Information's a two-way street on this. It can't just be, I'm holding on about me, but I'm expecting other people to come and support me without any information. That's a recipe for disaster. When, as support coordinators, we go, what are we looking for a participant? When we have that conversation to engage, we break that down. And then we provide the support worker or the provider with information that they need to know. That information is still provided at a minimum on what they actually need to know. The question is, how does the agency help support that to ensure that as providers, we get what we want and what we need to be able to provide those services, and the participants still able to retain a degree of privacy relative to what's not needed for that support being provided. If it's around the dollars, then that's obviously something that needs to be. Look, there's been a lot of scenarios where the withholding of information relative to diagnoses or behaviours or other information or money has caused breakdowns and big issues, both for the participant potential to their health and staff potential to their health. Information needs to be more forthcoming for supports, and I've always been a big advocate to having a really strong access and eligibility criteria and framework, and also have a strong conversation with participants to ask those questions and assess internally whether or not we have the right amount of information to continue on with that service.
Which also reminds me, Sam, when you do a referral business to business, please let the other provider know that the plan, if the plan is in PACE or in PRODA, because this is something that when people are doing referrals, sometimes they're skipping that bit of information and the participant is unsure and it makes it a bit of a shit show for the new provider. So please make sure you do that. Moving along, one of the things that they told us on Thursday was that if a participant is going to need more funding, say up front in the first funding period, say for example it's because they need to do assistive technology scripting, what an OT or a physio or any of the allied health professionals can put in their report is that more funding in this funding component needs to be allocated to the first funding period for this particular reason. So you must put that in your report if there is some reason why more funding needs to be in the first funding period.
Well, looks like they actually gave you something useful in that information session.
Yes. Now, you're all wondering, what do you do with service agreements do you do a new service agreement every 3 months? Do you do one service agreement and then in your schedule of support show the funding periods? What do you do? Let me tell you what the NDIS said in that information session. They said, that is a business decision that has nothing to do with the NDIS, and you have to figure it out for your business.
Well, that's been the stock standard line from them relative to any question that any business owner has ever had relative to how we do something, which is kind of the uniqueness of the whole system in a way, and also has given quite a lot of opportunities, but caused quite a lot of the problems that we're seeing. Ultimately, how we run our business is that's it. That's up to us. That's why I keep on going around the eligibility criteria, developing proper programs, and then understanding the services they're going to need. These conversations, if providers in independents specifically really need to pay attention, or anyone that doesn't has been lying on the outside of I'm not registered, so don't need great documentation. Now's the time to really start looking at improving, getting some stronger and more rigorous documentation and process to help answer these questions and build that service schedule of supports and service agreement. As I was saying earlier, that conversation around information and the intakes process, that's where we need to have these conversations. What's the total budget within the plan in the funding component? And then what's that broken down to in the funding period? One of the things I used to do as a support coordinator was always break this down and understand this as a standard. How much do we have weekly? How much are we doing monthly? How much are we doing quarterly? So then I can understand from a participant's perspective, the utilization. Are we overspending? Are we underspending? Have we used kind of the right amount? Because we know if we're doing a physio once a month for the year, that's 12. They've missed one, then there's only going to be like 2 out of the 3 in the quarter. So we know we're under. Then that asks a question. What's happened there? How are we going to get that supported? Did you not need that support? How do we use that? Do we need to move something else, change something around? It helps us understand more on how we can support. And I think it's a good thing. It might not be a good thing in the way and the lack of transparency and the lack of communication is being implemented. But I think from a financial management perspective, it does kind of bring some opportunities for some really good collaborative work from providers and participants to look at how we work together for better outcomes. Because that's, at the end of the day, what the NDIS review and everyone wants is better outcomes for people. And ultimately, it needs to be cost effective, because otherwise we're just going to blow out and not have money in with the way the world is. God. But at the end of the day, if we all work together, look at all of these things, yes, there will be periods and like instances and a lot of heartache around not being given the right amount of money. But that's a separate conversation to this. It's still a valid conversation, but it's separate to this. And we just need to look at it more so as in, how do we make sure we get the most out of what we've been given to get the most amount of support to utilize that? And then the conversation on how do we fill in the gaps from that is a different conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not like, while I can see why the agency has said that has gone their old sort of line, it does mean that good providers have opportunities to improve their services to get this information. And if you're not sort of working that, you're going to get caught up in the end. And that's really kind of the purpose of an open market at the end of the day.
Interesting.
But it's been, as we said, there's lack of communication, and this is all a very complex space. And the NDIS is still yet to give out some operational guidelines on it all. So we could be having a completely different conversation at some point in time soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. So that is the information we currently have on the changes with Section 33. We will bring you more information as it comes to hand. Until next time, bye.
Huzzah.
Thank you for listening. Please share with people you know. Until next time, as the Green Brothers say, don't forget to be awesome.